All right. So and we may have a few more people join us, but as we get started, let's begin and let us pray. Loving God, as we come together to consider the last book of the Bible with all of the different symbols and the numbers and how they interact together, it's getting this background can sometimes be challenging, can be difficult, and yet at the same time, we hope that we learn something new. And so be with us tonight as we discuss this, as we listen, and as we consider this last book of the Bible. We pray in Christ's name. Amen. All right, so I think Cheryl's now joining us. Well, welcome to week 2. Now I realize that some of you, oh, did I put the wrong one on? Hang on. No, this is lesson 2. Okay, so I'm just verifying because I think I didn't change that first slide. So working through what we had is, of course, last week it was just basically it was an introduction, but in the same way that some of the best commentaries that I've worked with with Revelation is that most of what we need to do is we need to do a lot of introduction before we can actually dive into the text of the book. I mean, it's sort of like because this isn't like swimming in a pool where you can just dive right in and swim around. This is rapids. We need to get the gear on. We need to do the safety discussions before we get into this, because Revelation is so different from anything that we've worked with in terms of any of the biblical texts or any type of literature that we may be familiar with. So this week is still part of that introduction. Before we actually dive into stuff next week in terms of actually going through the text, we're looking at the broad view of numbers and symbols, which make up so much of what Revelation is, that we're looking at the concept of what apocalyptic literature is, because Revelation is one of the best examples of a genre that no longer exists. And so if we don't take the time to understand what apocalyptic literature is, then the rest is going to be lost on us. So that's hopefully what I'm at least giving you a taste. Now, keep in mind, each of these sessions can be a full-on course in and of itself. We could do I could do a university level course on all the symbols of Revelation, and like a university course, like three classes a week for 2 hours each week, and we might get it covered in a semester. So this is still we're still very much on an overview kind of thing. So, and then next week is when we actually start getting into the content, and specifically we look at the letter to the 7 churches. On the 15th of November, we do have a 1-week break because I will be on study leave that week. Then we start getting into some of the symbols that we talk about this week, at least in terms of just the overview. We get into a little bit more detail, specifically with the images of the scrolls, the trumpets, and the bowls. Now, you might say, well, John, the scrolls and the trumpets, and then there's this big interlude, and then the bowls come back. Working with Revelation is kind of like peeling an onion, and not that it brings tears to your eyes, but the idea is that you peel off one shell and there's something underneath it, and you keep working your way through. And the scrolls, the trumpets, and the bowls represent one of those layers. Then week 5 is the core message of Revelation, pulling back the curtain, and that's among other things, that the infamous chapters 12 and 13. That'll be on November 29th. And then we get into then we get into week 6. And in terms of the ongoing core message, but the vision of ultimate hope. And then week 7, and this is 7 weeks deliberately, and hopefully tonight you'll understand why this is over 7 sessions, not 6 or 5 or 4 or 20. So week 7 is actually, the title of the course is called Reclaiming Revelation, is to say, how can we claim this book for ourselves, particularly as part of the United Church of Canada, or as part of our particular understanding of Christianity, and not let it fall into the hands of dispensationalists who've kind of monopolized it, especially over really since the end of the Second World War. And we'll get into that. Now, I know that some of you missed last week, but I did record it, so you can go back and watch it. But I might have to pull some of that information in. But we are going to do just a brief recap on it. So there's a couple things in terms of understanding what Revelation is, but there's also things like what it's not as well. But more specifically, I'm going with what it is that it is a form of writing known as apocalyptic literature. Now, here's an important distinction. We have an example of a Greek word that means something in Greek, and it's when it was translated or transmitted to English, which didn't exist at the time of this language, that the word apocalypse for us in English means what?
Catastrophe.
Catastrophe, end of the world, raining fire, etc., etc., etc. Okay, in Greek, the word apocalypse means literally means revelation. It means it's pulling back the curtain, it's revealing stuff. So apocalyptic, even though our ears, even my ears, even though I'm trained in this, I hear apocalyptic, I think, mushroom clouds and boom, meteors falling from the sky. Whereas someone in Greek literature would have simply said, oh, you're pulling the curtain back. And apocalyptic literature from a scholarly point of view means, there's a certain overlay of that just because of it getting transmitted forward, but it means literature that reveals. But it also does it using a particular technique and style of writing. And it, as a genre, it doesn't really exist anymore. But it was fairly widespread in about this roughly 300-year period around the end, the first century BC and AD. Although Ezekiel represents an early form of apocalyptic literature, of course, Daniel, which falls, Daniel kind of falls into that 200 BC period. And of course, Revelation is at the tail end of it. But these weren't the only. There are some biblical books that fall into the apocalyptic category. But there's a whole lot of non-biblical stuff that also fits into this as well. But from start to finish, like there are other examples of apocalyptic literature in the Bible. Parts of Daniel. Little phrases here, little passages out of Mark and Matthew, for example. But Revelation is the only work that is from start to finish apocalyptic, completely, like it is completely apocalyptic from beginning to end. And that's one of the reasons why it is as difficult to understand as it is. But there are other examples. None of this is locked in some Vatican vault someplace saying, you can't read this. There are hundreds of examples out there, and thanks to the internet, you can go read them. If you do a search on this, you can most certainly go and you can go read this and read this stuff for yourself. It's out there. For example, the War Scroll from the Dead Sea Scrolls is an apocalyptic work. It's an example of Jewish apocalyptic. So there are some things in that. So the other biblical examples, as I mentioned before, we have Ezekiel, we have Daniel, we also have Mark 13, we have Paul's first letter to the Thessalonians, but also outside of the Bible, in Jewish literature, we have the Apocalypse of Baruch, as I mentioned before, the War Scroll, and other Christian examples are the Shepherd of Hermas and the Apocalypse of Peter. These are just some. There's a lot more. There's a lot more out there. So here's the thing about apocalyptic literature that we often forget, is that the symbols, the language, and everything else is already known to the target audience. This is not written in code. Okay, and unfortunately, a lot of the modern, well, maybe not modern, but certain, especially within certain sects of Christianity, they claim that it's written in code and only we can tell you what it means. It is not written in code, but what it is that the symbols and the language and everything else that is used in Revelation, we have lost the context. And of course, the modern example I used last week, I've used before. For those of you who weren't here, so everybody who's here last week, for this one, and I'm going to bring this one back up. But if I put this statement out there, what am I talking about? The senators and the sabers battled it out for the Holy Grail.
Football? I don't know.
Well, you're Cheryl, you're close. Okay. Generally, if you're Canadian, that's hockey. Okay. And generally most people
So
kind of
the Holy Grail being Stanley Cup.
Exactly. Okay. Because you have the Senators being the team from Ottawa, the Sabres being the team from Buffalo, battling it out, battling it like a game for the Holy Grail of the Stanley Cup. But the thing is, someone who does not know anything about hockey might interpret that as political power and military power fighting it out over religious authority. But the thing is, because we're Canadian, like if I were to show that statement to say someone from, well, there was one example where I did lead this, and there was a woman there who was attending, who was originally from Italy, wouldn't have had a clue. Okay. On the other hand, if I were to say, for example, change that to say football, and when I say football, I don't mean gridiron football. I mean as Richard might put, proper football. I'm seeing him smile at that. Then that might be understood in terms of but altering the language, because different teams have different nicknames and that kind of thing. So think of reading Revelation is kind of like listening to a hockey broadcast when you have no idea what hockey is. And so what I'm trying to do is teach you how to play hockey, metaphorically, of course. Because apocalyptic literature itself is very symbolic in terms of its form and nature and function. It has this cosmic scale, and when I say dualistic in tone, the battle between good and evil, all those kinds of elements, things, and it uses visual language and numerology to basically deliver its message. And we're getting into this particular line here we're getting into tonight, but it's not in code. That's a big thing. Revelation is not in code. And as I said before, apocalypsis means to uncover or to reveal. It's the pulling back of the curtain. And that's what apocalyptic literature is. Now, I spent a fair bit of time last week coming alongside and explaining a type of interpretive framework for Revelation in particular that has been dominant really since the end of the Second World War. That kind of got its start in the 1820s, was when it first sort of came, but it's called dispensationalism. And one thing about dispensationalism is that a lot of the stuff that you probably heard about Revelation has come out of that, and unfortunately, it's an entire interpretive tradition that, like, it doesn't even get close to the target of what Revelation is about. And the trouble is, most of you may have been exposed to this in some way, shape, or form, and part of the challenge is to unlearn that, and to try and come up with it. And in fact, for those of you who saw this flyer that came out from the Seventh-day Adventist Church, this is exactly what I'm talking about. That they had this seminar, this prophecy seminar of all these things to come. The trouble is, Revelation has been used to predict the end of the world for about 1,700 years of its almost 1,900-year life. How many times has that been right? You're still here. That should be your hint. Okay, so we do have to consider some of that part of that. So anyway, apocalyptic literature is a specific genre of writing, and it has its own form. And that's what tonight is about, is getting into the form and style about it. But here's the thing: when sometimes I compare apocalyptic literature as the equivalent of first or second century science fiction. That is the best compliment I can pay it. Brad and Sue may understand this. I am a total sci-fi nerd. Okay, this is not in any way degrading it. It is actually elevating it up to the art form that resonates most with me as in my what it says to me. It is so this is the highest compliment I'm going to pay this. It's one of the reasons why I like it. But it does use the symbols, it uses poetry, it uses all kinds of languages and tools, pushing the limit of language to try to understand some of the ineffable nature of God, by actually not trying to explain at all, but rather using images to evoke. So it uses something called pictorial language, and we're going to get into that in just a bit. As opposed to what most of us, and even the language that I'm using right now, is called propositional language. In other words, it's logical, or mostly logical, tries to explain things. Whereas pictorial language doesn't try to explain; it's there to evoke stuff. So, any questions? My screed against the dispensationalism, I recorded last week. You can go back and watch it. It took about half of last week's thing, talking about how often Revelation has been used, like in popular culture. It's most influential around horror themes, and we just came off of Halloween, and a number of those things. And it's not intended to be used that way at all. I know I suggested that some of you go watch Steven Spielberg's movie Ready Player One, and I think some of you might have gotten 20 minutes into it. Yeah. Because it's weird, but the thing is, welcome to Revelation. So anyway, let's dive into this, and specifically wanting to talk about the difference between the propositional language that we use and the pictorial language that Revelation uses. And at the moment, probably you're going, what's propositional language and what's pictorial language? Well, here's propositional language is the stuff. This is how we communicate. Most of the stuff that we read. In other words, it objectifies the whenever symbols are used, they are used literally. For example, you might see the symbol pi there. Pi is a symbol that talks about the relationship between the circumference and the radius of the circle. Similar to science. It also is logical. Not only that, it is also, here's a technical term, diachronic. In other words, stuff happens in a sequence, start to finish. That everything happens in a linear pattern. Okay. This is important, we'll get to. And it also says myth is bad, truth is good. In other words, like myth equals fiction, as in not true, versus something that's quantifiable. And this is often how we communicate. Like this is how we expect to communicate, even when the language that we use doesn't do this. So I'm maybe trying to help with that. But on the other hand, pictorial language, on the other hand, is what's called non-objectifying. In other words, it doesn't try to quantify stuff. It brings something up and evokes. The symbols themselves, like where the symbols in something might mean literally this. Symbols are open-ended. They can mean a number of different things. They're intended to be evocative. It's also not logical, and that is intentional. It is impressionistic. We're going to get into that in a second. And not only that, as far as the time, like the concept of time in it, is that things are synchronic, that events and things happen simultaneously or in a cyclical or are layered on top of each other. And at this point, I've probably lost you. And not only that, myth is the vehicle of truth. In other words, by using these images, it's pointing to a greater truth. And hopefully, through this, you're going to see how that works. Particularly when I get into chapter 12 in session 5, I actually like take that apart completely, and you see how it works. So I realize that we're getting our head, that's a few sessions down, but we do get to do some of it. But it's masterfully done in chapter 12 and 13. So what I want to do is try and get you to understand like those two columns probably got lost in you. So let's work with something that may be something that you better understand. Propositional language might be, consider it the paintings of Robert Bateman. How many of you are familiar with Robert Bateman?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm seeing a lot of hands. We all know that basically it's very clear. That's a blue jay, that's a bear, those are seagulls, and the bear's walking through a river. Okay. In other words, yes, they do evoke a certain degree of he's an extraordinarily talented artist, and these are effectively snapshots within time, still life. The blue jay in winter, the grizzly bear, presumably crossing a river or hunting for salmon in a river. These you've probably seen before, and chances are you may actually have some of these prints in your house. I know my parents did. I'm not sure if I do or not, but these very much, the artist is painting something to represent something, and it's a direct one-to-one correspondence. You're looking at that and saying, well, that's a grizzly bear. On the other hand, pictorial language, the language that Revelation uses, is more like an impressionistic painting. Now, I'm using impressionistic from the broadest sense. For those of you who have some art school education, you might be a little bit more specific as to what this means, but I'm using this in the broadest sense. So say, for example, we've got Picasso. What are those? Okay. Aside from the fact that they're worth a lot of money, do you understand what they are? They are. So these are a couple of ones. Now, the next one I'm going to bring up actually caused a huge controversy, the decades ago when this one, that the National Art Gallery of Canada acquired Barnett Newman's Voice of Fire. And I think at the time paid $1.4 million.
$1.5 million.
$1.5 million at the time that it was created. And it created a huge firestorm politically, because people looked at that and said, I can do that in my basement. One guy tried to pay his taxes by doing the voice of water, by doing 3 blue stripes sideways that looked like that. And I'm going to pay my taxes with this. And the one thing about the Voice of Fire, now, curiously enough, it's actually now worth $5-6 million at least. So oddly enough, but we look at that, and generally for the most part, we look at that going, what is that? Now, I can actually say from experience, I've seen the Voice of Fire in person.
Me too.
And what I found was, looking at a picture of it like this, it didn't do anything for me. When I walked in the room and saw it, and I actually was like, it actually struck me emotionally, and not in an anger sense of we paid that. It was like this just impression of wow, in terms of its size, and at that point, for a very brief moment, I got it. Now, that having been said, it's one of these things where you have to go and see it for yourself, because a picture does not do it justice. But anyway, these are examples of pictorial language, things that are intended to evoke. They may not do anything for you, but that's part of it. And Revelation is like reading an impressionistic painting. And so the idea is, what I'm trying to hopefully get us to do as we're easing into the book is to get into the mindset of late first century Christians. Christians themselves who, at most at the time, and I did mention this last week for those of you who weren't here, we often overstate Christianity's presence and presence in the Roman Empire. Because at the end of the first century, there may have been a total of about 6,000 Christians across Asia Minor and mostly across Asia Minor and around the Greek islands. Some were down in Egypt. There were some that survived, survivors of the first Jewish-Roman War in and around that time. But 6,000 total across the entire Roman Empire. By comparison, in 2001, I brought this up last week. In 2001, and the entire Roman Empire at that point in time was anywhere from 80 to 100 million people across the board. So 6,000 people out of it, 80 to 100 million people. In Canada, in 2001, 20,000 people marked down their religious affiliation as Jedi from Star Wars. 20,000 people. There were more people by percentage that identified as Jedi in 2001 than by percentage than Christians did in the early Roman Empire. In other words, there weren't enough of them to be anything other than an other box on that check of checking off your religious affiliation. So we tend to overstate the presence of Christianity during this. And so it was a very small population in a very wide, very widespread and very overarching Roman Empire. So now we're going to actually get into some of the obvious symbols. Like for those of you who were here last week, I gave them a rather rough assignment. I said, I want you to sit down and read Revelation start to finish. Okay. And Janice, it took you an hour?
Yes.
Okay. Was that for those of you who managed to do it? I said it was optional.
Took me longer.
I
did it, but it took me longer than an hour.
Yep. Okay.
Took me longer than an hour, and I needed a half-hour break in the middle.
Yeah, I could see that because it can be quite a slog. This is more of sort of a description. Interesting little fun fact about Revelation is that it wasn't intended for people to sit down and read it. It was meant to be heard. The other thing is and a little interesting thing is that in our cycle of readings, about 1.5%, a little bit more than that, of our cycle of readings over a 3-year period include a reading from Revelation. However, 20 to 25% of Revelation is represented through the hymns in our hymn book. And so we don't like to read Revelation, but we like to sing it. And there's a good reason for that, that it lends itself well to singing imagery. So that's another piece to consider. But as we're going through, there's a number of different symbols. Is that the symbols themselves are the place that we encounter this the most, and whether it's a positive or quite often it's a case of the symbols can also be a stumbling block, because this is what we have when we read through this. And so some of the images and the symbols defy the imagination, or when we try to imagine it, it actually comes out pretty horrible. I don't have a picture of it here, but for example, there's a couple of examples of biblically accurate angels. Have any of you seen these images? And they're like just wings and eyes and all kind of weird imagery. And the caption for this one, it says, "Why are you afraid? I specifically told you not to be afraid." And the creature is this horrifying winged thing, but it's a biblically accurate angel. At least according to that. If I can find that image, I'll try and bring it back up. It's been floating around there. But the idea is that a lot of these symbols kind of defy our imagination, like the image of Christ with a tongue that is a double-edged sword, and that kind of thing. That's just it's kind of like, how does that work? I mean, it's going to be cumbersome. How does he talk? If his son, if there's this big sword hanging out of his mouth. And so the idea is that there's also a temptation to link stuff to this that we're able to understand and get our heads around. And sometimes what I'm trying to say is just kind of ease up on that and try to get into the mindset of first century Christians. So we're going to get into that. What we need to do is we have to set aside, to quote Yoda here, going into science fiction or science fantasy, we have to unlearn what we've learned. And so we have to actually set aside our 21st century worldview, try to go back, to late first century, and try to get our heads around it. Because keep in mind, every single symbol that we encounter in Revelation was not obscure to the original listeners. For those of you who joined me on the Genesis study, you might remember that this image here of how ancients understood the world, is that it looked kind of like a snow globe. Same sort of thing with Revelation. Some of the images that you see from Revelation is dependent upon this kind of worldview. The whole snow globe idea, that the stars are actually hung on a dome above that holds back the waters beyond them. So the waters below, the waters above, the stars are kind of hung on that, and that the ancients believed that earthquakes and shooting stars were actually connected, because you shake the earth, well, something's going to shake loose up top, and one of those decorations is going to come down. So that's part of that. So I'm going to be trying to get you to think inside the dome, because once you kind of do that, it actually helps, believe it or not, helps in getting into that understanding. So some of the images and symbols, I have 3 different slides of some of what those images are, and this is just kind of a taste. So this is more of along the lines of when you were, for those of you who read through it, what were some of the images and symbols that you noticed?
Okay. Well, okay, how did I have it? well, the images with the eyes
Yes.
coming out on all over, the eyes all over them.
Yep.
And then just eyes and flames.
Yep.
And let me see,
Mhm.
who else has?
Now this is, like I said, I've actually done up three slides. So, here we have, these are just examples, just shooting them out there. Eyes, angels, elders, interestingly enough, lamb, lion,
Yeah.
horns, living creatures. And it just kind of continues on. We have things like diadems, those are jewels. We have dragon, seal, scrolls, bowls, beast, trumpet. All these kinds of images. And then we have also mountains, swords, stars, sun, sackcloth, tree of life, riders.
Yeah.
This is not all of them. I've done up three slides. This is just kind of a rapid fire taste of some of the ones that you probably would have encountered. None of these are literal. None of these are literal at all. Okay. Everything has a symbolic meaning behind it. And so, so the idea is each of these symbols are intended to engage people at an emotional level rather than an intellectual one. So the trouble is, we think, I mean, I will fully own my spiritual style is rational. Okay. So I like trying to think my way through this. Is often one of the things that I try to do, and we try to make associations with them as quickly as we can, rather than letting the image actually evoke stuff. So the one thing is that the symbols all have multiple meanings. They can mean more than one thing. And they can evoke a whole bunch of different things, but they're also, the images themselves are not, they're not neutral. Okay, they have certain things, and we do use this kind of language much more than we realize. That depending upon your political stripe, the names that you have for the political parties that you don't like, if you've got a nickname for them, I'm looking at you, Brad. If there's a nickname that you don't like, these are examples of like layered, non-neutral examples of symbols towards things like like one only has to like if you don't have to look very far. Similarly, also, this may come up a little bit later, but also political cartoons are a very good example of how we use symbols. Like, for example, particularly with US politics, you have the symbol of an elephant and the symbol of a donkey. And if you see them sort of personified in the suit, one represents, the donkey represents the Democratic Party, and you have the elephants representing the Republican Party. So far, even so far as those political parties actually incorporate those animals into the symbols of their party. On the other hand, we use national symbols to, like, for example, Canada, to quote an Arrogant Worms song, "We are the beaver." And whereas we tend to think of Russia, the bear, eagle, United States. But again, there's all these bulldog, the UK, it would be, and it also helped that Winston Churchill kind of looked like one. But we do use these symbols without really thinking of them. And so, same thing during the Roman Empire. And these meanings would be obvious. And so, but the other thing is, it also deeply connects into the Old Testament. I'll get the exact statements in the roughly 530 odd verses in Revelation. There are 740 references to the Old Testament. So not only do you that means that each verse has about 1.25 references to, if you do it mathematically, 1.25 references to in each verse to the Old Testament. It's more like you have groups that are just multi-layered on top of each other. So, for example, Isaiah chapter 6, the encounter that Isaiah has, this vision that Isaiah has in the temple, corresponds directly to the images evoked in Revelation 4. The tree of life image in Revelation chapter 2 is from Genesis chapter 3, and it's all throughout Revelation. Just and honestly, it would take you a very long time to go through and find every reference. But we're going to delve deeply into one of those particular images. The example that is frequently used in Revelation is the word Babylon. And for Janice and Marilyn in particular, you encountered Babylon, the word Babylon. Okay. Well, what is Babylon? And aside from the reference to Babylon 5, sci-fi show, one of my favorites, Babylon.
What's the country or the city?
Or it was a city, specifically because nation states as we know them didn't exactly exist. But what you had was empires built around a central city. So the Assyrian Empire was built around largely, I think, like Nineveh in the north. But you also had in this particular case, Babylon was a city that was a capital of a Mesopotamian empire, at least in this particular point that reached its height roughly 600 years before the birth of Christ. And Nebuchadnezzar is named specifically in the Bible. The Babylonians are named in the Bible. Technically, from a historical point of view, this was the Neo-Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar. But Babylon itself is actually, the physical location of it is in modern day Iraq, just not too far southwest of what is now Baghdad. So that just, if you're looking at a map and looking for it, you will actually Babylon is an internationally recognized historic site. But Babylon itself, as they more or less, as the Assyrian Empire fell, the Babylonian Empire rose, and basically the holdings of the Assyrian Empire fell into the hands of the rising Babylonian Empire. And of course, as they expanded and went to conquer, to expand their territory, to expand their political influence, they invaded. Like the Assyrians had done this 200 years before and actually destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel. Like Israel as we know it was actually like the Israel of King David broke into two separate kingdoms, a north kingdom and a southern kingdom. Southern kingdom became known as Judah. The north kingdom was either called Israel or Ephraim. It was destroyed 200 years before, roughly 200 years before. Well, give or take, maybe 150 years, sort of in that range. But as Babylon stepped into the power vacuum left behind as the Assyrian Empire began to decline and Babylon's star began to rise, they of course expanded in similar directions, including into Judah. And in those expansions, where the Assyrians failed to gain full control over Judah, the Babylonians succeeded, and they they laid siege to Jerusalem, destroying the walls and especially the temple in roughly 587 BC. And that began a period known as the exile. And the exile, as I've described before, is the most important part of biblical history that you've never heard of. If it wasn't for the exile, you would not have a Bible, period. It was that influential. And yet, because it was the forming element of it, often the stories around it were not, they were alluded to, but not specifically laid out in a historical fashion. But the period of the exile was extremely important to the life of that. But of course, empires often rose and fell on the backs of on the shoulders of their rulers. Another important one that would come later would be Alexander the Great, for example. But after Nebuchadnezzar died, Babylon's star began to wane. I mean, it still took a good 80 years for it to happen. And then the Persians, to the further east of Babylon, in Persia, what is now Iran, they invaded and subjugated Babylon and therefore all of its holdings. And Babylon itself fell in 529, and the city of Babylon eventually it just withered. And by 141 BC, so 250 years before the writing of Revelation. By the way, for those of you who missed last week, Revelation is thought to have been written specifically between 90 and 95 in the first century. And so 250 years before the writing of Revelation, Babylon is a ruin. It doesn't exist anymore. So it cannot possibly mean the actual literal physical city of Babylon, because it's a ruin. It's not there anymore. So it is by definition evocative when it appears in Revelation. But because of that experience of the exile, this whole experience remained imprinted on Israel's culture, and then by extension into the development of early Christianity. And that would continue. And so that memory of that name of the hated oppressive empire continued as its legacy. And so Babylon eventually became the metaphor for any external imperial domination. For example, when Babylon appears in Daniel, for example, it's not meaning Babylon because Daniel is also an apocalyptic work. It's not referencing the physical city of Babylon. It's representing in this case with Daniel, the successor kingdoms to Alexander the Great, specifically the Seleucid and the Ptolemaic kingdoms. The Seleucids being based more in Mesopotamia, but still a Greek empire, and the Ptolemies in Egypt, also still a Greek empire, successor kingdom to Alexander the Great. That's when it started being used for that. But of course, by the time that Christianity began to arise, the dominant imperial power was Rome, and it dominated the political scene. By the way, if you have any questions, just stick up your hand. There is never a bad time to ask. And so Rome was now the dominant power, and we know that in the early first century, that, for example, in Romans 13, so somewhere around the mid 50s to late 60s in this, or sort of the mid 50s on through to the early 60s, important distinction, early 60s, that early Christians looked upon Rome with some favor. I mean, Paul's in chapter 13 looks upon Rome as being quite favorable. But unfortunately, after the persecution, That began to sour. I think I got my date wrong there. And Nero's famed. There was a fire in Rome, and Christians became a simple scapegoat. Nobody knew who they were anyway, and it just Christian terrorists and take care of them. And so with that, and then of course in the aftermath of the First Jewish-Roman War, the favorability that Rome had amongst early Christians faded almost like it evaporated. And so what then began to happen is Christians started to use the term Babylon as a way of referring to Rome. And there's a couple reasons for this. Is that it wasn't just simply an allegorical, Babylon equals Rome. It's also evoking that sense of injustice and the exile and all of the sense of evoking resistance against this hated external empire. And so all of that reminding them that, but also the other piece of that is that they all knew that Babylon as a city also lay in ruin. And because it lay in ruin, it was expressing a hope that ultimately Rome would eventually fall. And it's evoking that. It's like Babylon, yes, it was injustice, it fell. Same thing will happen with Rome. This will not last forever. So any questions before we move on to this is the we're dealing with more of the obvious things. And so I just pulled out one symbol. Now every one of the symbols that I brought up earlier, eyes, horns, bowls, cymbals, trumpets, all of that, I could go into the same kind of detail with Babylon. I don't have time to do that. But what I'm trying to do is give you a sense of every time you hear one of these symbols is to understand there's an enormous depth under every single one of those symbols. And sometimes it's good practice to just pick a symbol and work it, just to try and understand stuff behind it. So now we're going to, oh, Betty, I saw your hand.
Yeah, I watched Prophecy America or something on on Joy TV, I think it was.
Yeah.
And there was a series of them. And this US prophet, he called himself a prophet. Anyways, he said the great Babylon that's spoken about in Revelation is the United States. And he gave hundreds of references as to where the Bible tells you this.
Well, I mean, here, curiously enough, that's a slightly different spin on it, but that's still very much in that dispensationalist mindset that somehow it's been divorced from its history. Now, that having been said, he's not, here's the troubling part. He's actually not entirely wrong. Because from the point of view of external empire, or that when you have imperial powers over time, for example, Protestants tended to refer to the Roman Catholic Church as Babylon for similar reasons of this external rule being imposed upon us. And so in the same way, when you have the United States of America is and has been effectively an imperial power, as has Great Britain, as has France, as has Russia. All of these things can be applied to any one of these great powers over time. I mean, at one point it was Spain. Spain was the great power, and so the trouble that I would have with that particular broadcast would be, he's narrowing it down too much, and yet he's not entirely wrong. So, yeah, David.
Yeah, I think you could go to any part of the globe where there was a kind of a mastery over a large area, and say the same thing.
Oh, yeah. I
Looking
mean,
at the Mongol Empire, for
yeah.
example.
Well, the largest
I mean,
empire
we
that
don't-
the world has ever seen.
Yeah, and we don't normally think about it, but
Yep.
yeah, there you are.
Yeah.
So
I mean,
it could go anywhere.
yeah, and what this is that there's a like what we can do is Revelation's timelessness allows it to apply its observation, even though Revelation is specific to the Roman Empire. Because of the way that its language works, it can be a cautionary around imperial power in general, and that's what and so that's something to keep in mind. So thank you for bringing that up, Betty, and of course David, that because you can start to see, like, when we come back to the whole reclaiming Revelation of how do we use this book now, that becomes part of the conversation. And sort of the cautionary is that and the question for us as Christians is, are we part of the empire, or are we part of the empire, or even though the term wasn't investment, but colonialism, for example, is an extension of empire. So that can be something that becomes that is brought up. Anyway, let's kind of shift gears a little bit, and let's get into the stuff that you probably, oddly enough, this may be a little easier to understand and more difficult to understand because it's not as obvious as we think it is, but we're dealing with numbers. Every number that appears in Revelation is symbolic. Okay, none of them are to be taken literally. Okay, so these people who are doing the math in terms of when Jesus is coming back, for example, misses the boat entirely in terms of what Revelation is trying to say. So the numbers themselves are symbolic in ways that are obvious, and some of them are downright obscure. And I'm going to try and get into that today, because this is where I'm going to have a little fun, I hope. So some of the numbers that you have, like, actually, here, let's back that up. I just spoiled the first one. What are some of the numbers that you encountered when you were going through?
7 and 12.
7, 12, yeah.
6 wings, 6 wings.
Okay.
Yeah.
4 creatures.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, 24. Yeah, the 24 around the one
Yep.
throne.
666
Oh, yeah.
Mhm.
and 144.
Yes, and 144. So so some of those numbers that like you kind of got most of them. But generally 1, 3, 4, 7, 7, 12, 666. And of course those 6, curiously enough, those 6 wings, that is actually straight out of Isaiah 6. Particularly evoking that image. That is almost word for word. Well, not word for word, but definitely image for image. The living creatures that Isaiah encounters in his vision in the temple in Isaiah chapter 6. You can take some time, go back and read that. But what we have is the other piece, and this is something that you also that may make your hair kind of stand up on end, or at least kind of feel it in your spine, depending on where you are with that. Is that Revelation contains numerology. It is actually quite dependent upon numerology. And in fact, one of the things that I brought up last time was saying that John of Patmos was skilled in Greek mathematics, and Greek mathematics is automatically, they were numerologists. There wasn't like you didn't have people who did just math and people who were numerologists. They were the same because they believed that numbers had a mystical power in and of themselves. And so we know from that the writer was schooled in Greek mathematics, and the numbers all mean something. So what we have is that the numbers themselves are kind of like adjectives. They add value, or add they add a description. Think of them like more like adjectives rather than like physical representations of numbers. So that they're adding or adding commentary to them. So let's get into some of the numbers. 3. All right, what does 3 represent? Well, 3 is, now here again, this is on probability, so I'm not saying this is absolutely what it means, because if I'm doing that, I'm being quite declarative. It's 3 is likely symbolic of heavenly matters, that it is symbolic of heaven. Partly the doctrine of the Trinity was still prototype at this point in time. It hadn't fully formed at this point in time, but certainly the image of 3 being a symbol for heaven is part of it. The shape itself is a triangle. It is the smallest polygon, often representative of perfection, and most architecture relies on the triangle as a shape of building. And so that shape is very much part of it. On the other hand, 4, David, I saw your hand.
Okay. Why is my why is 3 likely symbolic of heavenly matters? Why?
Well, for example, an early Christian blessings were Trinitarian. Like, for example, in the Gospel of Matthew, go out into the world, baptizing people in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So, and so that became associated with heaven, but also triangles. It tended to point up. Roofs, like you'd have roofs that would also point skyward. It was roughly the shape of a mountain. The mountains were seen as heavenly. So there's any number of different reasons as to why that might be. None of them necessarily definitive, but we do know that for the most part, 3 was associated with a heavenly. The heavenly expressions.
From how far back?
It's hard to say. Certainly, I mean, I would have to go back through Greek mathematics, but there was often, like particularly, especially when it came to the triangle, regardless of the shape, it's the simplest polygon, and so some would evoke this, because you can't divide it down any further, that it was seen as an optimal or almost perfect shape.
Wondering if it went back to Mesopotamia, or like how far back might it have gone?
Now, probably most like here, I don't want to kind of push how far back it went, because a lot of this, keep in mind that John of Patmos was schooled in Greek mathematics. So, here at this point, you like Pythagoras, for example, who himself studied, like the Pythagorean theorem is all about triangles. And so we know for sure that it was operation, at least as far as John of Patmos was concerned, it was very much present in the kind of mathematics he was schooled.
I don't see how that could jump over to a religious doctrine.
Well, keep in mind, all numerologists was considered to be a spiritual practice, not a
Numerology. Okay.
Numerology.
Well, so was the Greek gods. I don't know if it had anything to do with that part.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Spoiler alert: there are Greek gods in Revelation.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah.
I'm not surprised, actually.
Like you have to understand that that Revelation was written in a Greco-Roman environment, and Greek thought is very pervasive through this. Even though, yes, it's a Christian document, it is very all that Greek. You know, we partly is getting you to think a little bit like Greeks rather than you know, we're not hanging around Jerusalem. This is island of Patmos, just off what is modern day Turkey, which is still part of modern day Greece. And when we get into the letters of the seven churches next week, you can see that like it's removed from Jerusalem, and we're firmly within Greek culture, including the mathematics and everything else. If this is stuff that people would know. Marilyn.
Didn't you say Revelations was written around the 600? So it's later than a lot of the rest of the Bible.
Revelation was written actually. It is Revelation is not the youngest book of the Bible. It was written at the end of the 1st century, so roughly between 90 to 95, about roughly 60 years after the crucifixion of Christ, give or take. So end of first century. Whereas some parts of the New Testament wouldn't be written until about 150, almost 60 years later. So if anything, it's kind of smack in the middle.
Oh,
So.
okay.
Yeah.
John,
Yes.
coming back to 3.
Yes.
Briefly, I mean, you mentioned pyramidical figures as well. So going back to the Greeks, Egyptian civilization as well. I mean, they were built in some ways to try to evoke a reaching to the heaven.
Yes.
And so that kind of makes sense to me.
Yeah. And I mean, there's a lot of that kind of imagery with it. I mean, do keep in mind the pyramids of Egypt. I mean, people may have been aware of them, but the pyramids of Egypt were already old by the time that Revelation was written, for example. I mean, in fact, the distance in time between us and the writing of Revelation is smaller than the distance between the writing of Revelation and the building of the pyramids.
Say that again.
Okay, the time difference between put it this way, you know Cleopatra, the historical figure.
Yeah.
We are closer, like when it comes to time travel, we are actually closer to Cleopatra than Cleopatra is to the building of the pyramids. That's how old they are. And so, you know, and certainly if you look at a bridge or a building or anything, a triangle is an integral part of, like it is an important, a very important architectural tool. And generally it's seen, there's a certain degree of perfection that, and the Greeks were kind of hung up on this, that they attributed to mathematics a much higher spiritual value than even the nuttiest, the biggest math nuts today. That there was a divine presence in the numbers themselves, and John of Patmos was very firmly in that school of that religious understanding of mathematics. So anyway, let's continue. So we've got 3. Now let's get to 4. 4 may actually be a little easier to understand because it becomes symbolic of the earthly matters. And so this one may be a little bit more obvious, I hope. 4 winds, you've heard that term. You know, scattered to the 4 winds, or calling to the 4 winds. We also have 4 elements in Greek understanding of the world: air, earth, fire, water. That there were certain schools that basically any element that existed. This is prior to the discovery of atoms, molecules, and that they believe that all matter, all material, were basically combination, either singles or combination of those 4 elements. So four elements. 4 directions: northeast, southwest. Never eat soggy wieners if you want to do have a little mnemonic to remain it, to remember what your compass point directions are. Then we get to, well, okay, that's fine. 3 divine, 4 we can get to. Well, what about 7? 4 plus 3 is
7.
Mhm.
Oh. I know. It's the perfect Earth.
Yeah, the idea is it's the, you've heard the phrase heaven and earth. 7 is evocative of heaven and earth. And so in that sense, it's considered to be a complete number. I mean, it's still a prime number, but it's a complete number. So 4 because 4 plus 3 is 7. Okay, so the idea is that we have this element of completeness. There are also 7 days in a week, curiously enough. Also, a lunar month is 4 groups of 7. And for those of you, we're currently on this phase tonight, and just for the fun of it, there is a total. There's actually a total lunar eclipse coming a week from today. So if the skies are clear, now it's actually, it'll be very, very late Monday night or very early Tuesday morning. But on the 8th, there is a lunar eclipse coming, a blood moon for those people. There was one time when I was serving in Drumheller, was a period where there were 4 lunar eclipses back to back, and the dispensationalist, I think John Hagee Jr., I think probably was the most famous for this, screaming about the blood moon and how it's all going to come to an end. Because we're getting 4, kind of 4 in a row. Well, we're still here. But if you want to get up late at night and watch the moon turn to a coppery red, that's next week. Ron, you've got a question.
I do, yeah. As I look at this, I'm thinking, if we think back to imagining ourselves as first century people, I'm thinking that some of these numbers are they're limited by the view from which we observe them. In other words, 7 days in a week in a lunar month. These are things that are related to the universe as we see it. And are we thinking big enough?
Yeah. And from the first century perspective, yes, like these are what they were evoking. And so part of what we do with Revelation is to say, okay, like thinking from their perspective, heaven and earth, like to them it made perfect sense. To us, it's kind of like, huh?
Do you think there is a way that these same symbols can be extrapolated into our time?
Only insofar, my personal route is kind of, let's go back to the first century and then kind of pull them back. But at the same time, like for example, things like, for example, the lunar month. I mean, we tend to work on solar calendars, or solar years. And oddly enough, I mean, the calendar that we use today, the Gregorian calendar, is a faith-based calendar. And the whole reason that and yet it is scientifically accurate. The whole reason that it was developed was to make sure that we got the day of Easter correct.
Yep.
Because at the time, the calendar that was that would have been used was still a solar calendar, the Julian calendar, that started to be used, but it was off. Like They didn't know it at the time, but it was off.
Yep.
And it wasn't until the Gregorian reforms that corrected it. And it's one of the reasons why Eastern Orthodox traditions celebrate Christmas on January 7th as opposed to December 25th. December 25th, one of the reasons why is because by the time the Christians started actually celebrating Christmas, that's actually when the winter solstice fell. It was on December 25th. And yet when things got shifted back with the Gregorian calendar, Christmas remained on December 25th, even though its actual date was the same date as the winter solstice. I mean, that's outside of what we're talking about here, but it's an interesting side.
Happy leap year.
Yes. So and the whole the leap years, but also if the year ends in as if the year is divisible, if the century mark or the 100-year mark is divisible by 4, that one gets a leap year. But if it's not, like for example, the year 2100, I don't think it's going to be a leap year. I don't think it's a leap year. So you know, there's sort of interesting things that are with that. So if 7 was so how do you think we got to 12? Where are my mathematicians?
3 times 4?
Bingo. And what you also have is the completeness of heaven and earth combined as well, but represented at 12. But there's also 12 disciples, 12 tribes of Israel. So in that sense, this is where some of that Old Testament imagery is being pulled forward. Other little bit, and this one I'm not 100% sure, but this is one that Eugene Boring's commentary came in, is that 12, and I haven't managed to confirm this outside of Eugene Boring, is that he made the claim that 12 was also considered an unlucky number in Roman society. So there's something interesting in play. I can't necessarily confirm that. David, you've kind of got a clap up. You know, was that intended as a hand?
It was intended as a hand.
Yes.
Yeah, I was thinking 12 suits and a deck of cards.
Mm-hmm.
And that seems to have come from all of this.
Yes. Yeah, well, you know, because in a deck of cards, you got you know,
the cards, you've got the 3s and the 4s and 12s and a whole bunch of other things that come together. There's a very good story about a soldier explaining to his commanding officer why he carried a deck of cards with him.
Yeah.
Oh, I love that.
I've seen that, yeah.
I love that one.
Yeah, and so here, like here again, you have that kind of evocative imagery. So now we've kind of got the basics. 3, 4, and then 7 and 12 are basically additions or multiples of the first 2 numbers. Now 1,000, on the other hand, seems like it's not kind of divisible by this, but generally 1,000 is intended to it's representative of. It does not mean literal. It is represented a fullness or a completeness of, especially when it's combined with other numbers. So for example, you have 1,000 years or something akin to that. 1,000 years, 144,000. 144,000 is 12 times 12 times 1,000. Okay, so you've got the and 24 is 12 plus 12. Most of the time, the numbers that you have in here are divisible by 4 or 3. Most of the time. So now some of the other numbers we get into, and you know, the thing is that there are other numbers that are there. But they are intended again to form a symbolic, not a literal thing. For example, even if they're referencing a period of time, like 1,260 days, they're not intended to be literal. These are all used symbolically and metaphorically. Even if we're not sure of what those are, avoid trying to interpret it literally, but try to understand them. These are intended to be used symbolically or metaphorically. There is one exception, sort of, because one of the numbers that appears in Revelation in one particular spot acts as a direct identifier that this corresponds to one thing in particular, and that is the infamous 666.
Okay.
Okay, this is the number you came for. What does 666 mean? Well, it is referred to as the number of the beast in Revelation chapter 13, verse 8. And just want to verify that. Sort of famously quoted in Iron Maiden's number of the beast song, in a sort of this ominous spoken voice at the beginning. You know, it says this calls for wisdom. Let anyone with understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a person. Its number is 666. And keep in mind, Arabic numerals, that 666, those three swirls that we call 666, are not it is not that. In Revelation, that those three numbers grouped together in that kind of form is not what is represented in Revelation at all. These are not Arabic numerals. The numbering conventions that we use when we write, we use Arabic numerals, and Arabic numerals like Arabic, as we understand, like as a writing form, was still in its infancy around this time. Most of the time, it used alphabets, because Arabic and Hebrew are from the same family of languages called Semitic languages, and so the numbers that we use today are Arabic. This was prior to all this. So this is not 666 is not accurate. 666 is. And so those Arabic numerals, and that's the one thing is in the various Omen series, like, you know, under the hair, like the spawn of the devil has like 3 6s sort of as a birthmark hidden underneath the hair. And if you've ever watched the Omen series horror movies, it's not that at all, even remotely close. Curiously enough, some versions of Revelation say 616. We're going to get to that. If you actually, depending upon the translation that you have, there's a little footnote that says other ancient authorities read 616. But what you actually have is 666 is not spelled out in a shorthand numeric form. It is actually spelled out if you read the original Greek. So let's do some calculating of the number of the beast. At the time, prior to the use of Arabic numerals to do math, and that we use commonly without even realizing that like when we write 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, that's Arabic. And prior to that, using numbers in Greek, Hebrew, and Roman alphabets, all used their existing characters to actually symbolize numbers. Like, how many of you had to study Roman numerals when you were okay? Roman numerals, for example, are the best example of that. You know, and quite often is the only time that I encountered Roman numerals growing up was looking at the end of movies, like you know, this movie was released in MCM XX, you know, all these kind of, what the heck is that? And you know, so I mean, we did learn a bit about Roman numerals, at least a little bit. I mean, yes, we even still use them. Like if I'm drawing an outline, quite often I'll use Roman numerals. But Roman numerals are, you know, 2 I's is 2, V is 5, In the same way, in Greek and Roman alphabets, they also use characters to symbolize certain numbers. And curiously enough, here's a little handy dandy chart of what those are in Hebrew. And so, for example, the different letters are actually describe certain numbers. And the thing is, with that, is if you had your name written out, each of the letters in your name corresponded to a certain letter. So your number is would be like adding like adding up the numerical values of your name would provide a numerical value of your name. Calculating your name and number. So so we're going to take this as a little bit of a guide. What is my number? Okay. I'm a little distracted. My father-in-law is trying to call me at the moment. I'm going to have to call him back later. So my name, when spelled out in Hebrew, looks something like this. Okay. It's only approximate, but it is it comes out like my name in Hebrew is Yohanan, and then what you have here is a transliteration of my last name. Each of those letters has a number. My number is 405 because you have Yod equals 10, Het 5, Nun twice. See right here being 50 and 50, and then Kof 20, Resh 200, the Vav 6, Dalet 4, and Samek 60. Add that up, get 405. Interesting. So let's take someone who was not well regarded by Christians at the time. When calculating the number of the beast, particularly, there was a Roman emperor who was so bad that early Christians really didn't like him. And they were always concerned that he would come back, or that any successor would effectively be Nero. Well, and I've just spilled the beans. Nero Caesar again. So Nero Caesar, guess what? If you add up all the numbers in this, you get 50 plus 200 plus 6. Anybody got a calculator? Plus 50 plus 100 plus 60 plus 200.
666.
Bingo. And here's a little interesting, specifically in Hebrew, it's Neron is so NR roughly ON in terms of but in Greek the N is dropped. And remember how I said 616 in some other translations? If you drop 50 from this, you end up with 616. So in this particular case, it is pointing very specifically, not necessarily to Nero Caesar in the flesh, but specifically pointing at the Roman Empire or the Roman emperors specifically. And so again, it's pointing to something, but it's also doing it symbolically. And so all of these numbers and symbols are acting together in this pictorial language to communicate this special message to an intended audience. But here's the thing. Here's where it gets really obscure and stuff that we completely lose in translation. In the language itself, Revelation is written in bad Greek, or specifically bad, what is called Koine, or New Testament, or more or less street Greek. But it's written in bad Greek. Anybody who tries to read Greek and reads Revelation, they think, oh boy, this is a big slog. Think you're reading it in English is bad? Try reading it in the original Greek. It's filled with all kinds of grammatical errors, all kinds of different turns of phrases that are very difficult to translate. And initially, it was thought that the writer of Revelation, John of Patmos, didn't know Greek very well. And for a long time, that was a consensus. That consensus has now changed because the kinds of errors that were made in Revelation are things that someone who's just learning Greek would not make. In other words, it is written in intentionally bad Greek. So the phrasing and the words are intended to be a little off-putting, partly to keep people paying attention, but it's also intended to do that sort of thing. Modern example: if so strong with the force Yoda is, words put them in the right order. Why can't he? You know, character from Star Wars seems to speak in really odd language, but it made him appear wise. Similarly, with Revelation, that intentionally bad Greek is also intended to represent with language breaking down. But it's the new possibility is the realization that in fact Revelation is written in a poetic style, as opposed to a written out grammatical style. And it makes sense with all the symbols, is that the symbols themselves are strange. It's not unexpected that the language itself is a poetic form and therefore strange. It's intended for you to hear it. And so the language is musical. This, Ron, this is kind of coming back to your field, but also one of the reasons why Revelation works so well as an inspiration to a lot of the hymns that we have is that the language itself is musical. And so this kind of comes forward, is that in this case, to borrow a Canadian, the medium is the message. So not only are the symbols there, but the way in which the language itself is actually used becomes part of it. Because what we actually have is that the symbols themselves not only interact with each other in an obvious way, but they're actually a little bit more subtle. And here I bring up the example of Revelation chapter 7, verses 5 through 8. Where we have, and then what we have is this: from the tribe of Judah 12,000 sealed, from the tribe of Reuben 12,000, from the tribe of Gad. What you have here is this rhythm that is happening as part of that, naming off 12,000, naming off the different tribes. But you're actually seeing a song form here, and curiously enough, and I may get a little ahead of myself, it's also the number of syllables present in the phrases. So not only are images of 3, 4, 7, 12 evoked verbally, but also the number of syllables that are present. Okay, so it's poetic. And so we have these phrases of groupings and sayings. Like we even have a group, like for example, Revelation chapter 7, verses 5 through 8. You have this grouping of 12, but also 7-word phrases, 12-word phrases. And unfortunately, you can't do this in going through and reading it in English. Because to translate stuff, sometimes we have to throw in some extra words. And so that's some, like, unless you're sitting down and reading it the original Greek, which I'm not sure, if you really want to do it, go knock yourself out. But you have these things that just don't make the translation, of seeing that cadence and phrases through it. It's one of the more interesting things about Revelation that almost nobody knows about, because like this is in the really obscure category, that the language itself is constructed around numbers. And so what you have is a total package. That would be a good way to put it. That you have, not only are the numbers evoked in the text, but the text itself is made up of these numbers. So for how many of you how many is that new information?
It's wonderful. And it really ties in with so much of what we already know. Like, we know that the majority of people didn't read. So of course they were spoken to or sung to. And in teaching children who have learning disabilities, you know, if you teach them something and you say, make this into a song, they will remember it.
Yeah, you know, Cheryl, I hadn't thought about that, but you're exactly right. That the musical nature of Revelation has been something we've been sort of tangentially aware of for some time, but in the actual phrasing in the Greek, something that is phrased musically or poetically is easier to remember.
Yeah, and it sticks in your head, like it
Yes,
goes
it does.
around like that worm in your head.
Yep. So so again, like so not only do you have all these different images, but you also have it phrased in a lyrical way. So what we actually have in you know, in using the numbers and the words together, of course, 7 letters to 7 churches, so you've got 7 different sections, but also in the language itself. Now, of course, next week is when we get into the 7 letters to the 7 churches. So I believe, yeah, this is where we're preparing for next week. So before I bring up that slide, any questions or any more questions?
Yeah,
No,
I have.
Okay,
Oh,
so
okay.
in order, let's do Betty and then David.
Okay, in the number 12, when
Yes,
it says completeness of the heaven and earth, wouldn't that also be the connectiveness of all things, heaven
Yes.
and earth,
Yes.
environmentally, like what's happening now? Yeah.
Yeah. So there's the connectedness. There's also the connectedness, completeness, but also the interrelatedness as well. Again, like one of the things about using symbolic language is that keep in mind, I'm not trying to say this is all that it means, but if that is what it's evoking for you, awesome. Because like all of a sudden you're bringing stuff back to me that I'm learning about it and saying, yeah, I can see that. And that's the beauty of pictorial or symbolic language, is that it is intended to evoke beyond what the author originally intends. So like if John of Patmos was like, it was very important for John of Patmos that it be transmitted the way he wrote it. He didn't want anything changed. You know, and that's sort of indicated at the very end of Revelation itself, is that he wanted it transmitted in terms of that. But what it evoked in people was like is effectively turning it over to God interacting with the Holy Spirit as we listen to it. And so if that's and so I like what you just brought up, Betty, is beautiful. I think that works wonderfully well. So David.
Okay, well, first, just on that, a picture is worth 1,000 words. We've all heard that expression, I guess. So there is something to that. But my question was about the number 40.
Yes.
Which wasn't mentioned here. So.
No, I didn't mention 40, but 40 is a common biblical image indicating a long period of time. Like 40 days and 40 nights.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And it's mentioned in other areas as well in the Bible. You see it referred to quite often, actually. Yeah.
And so so what you have there is anytime that's pulling forward specifically the symbolic meaning of 40 from the Old Testament, which, you know, I mean, I suppose you could say, well, you know, 40 is just basically you know, is 4 times 10, but because of the older traditions with the number 40 especially, that's pulling in it, for lack of a better term, an artifact from another language, but and he's integrating it in.
Yeah, I'd be interested to see how, or you know, who in the ancient history past started that.
Yeah. Well, and part of it was like kind of, you know, I need a suitably, like a suitably big number or something akin to that. The,
Doesn't seem so large in relation to some of the ages of the people that you encounter, like Methuselah and so
Yeah.
on.
yeah, and sorry. Now that having been said, the whole thing with Methuselah is outside of Revelation's bailiwick, but you know, keep in mind sometimes these numbers are exaggerated. Whereas in Revelation's case, it's not about exaggeration of numbers; it's using them symbolically.
I wonder what the symbolism for 40 was.
Well, generally it was considered to be a long period of time in the wilderness for 40 days, and 40 nights, rain for 40 days, 40 nights. Usually it was intended to be representative of a period of time. Just, you know, it like numerically, it works out to about 6 weeks. You know, roughly, it's just, you know, just over a month. But at the same time, it is like, you know, the wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, long period of time, is generally what it's intended to be. So, any other questions? Because now I have these for those of you who weren't here last week. I have optional assignments depending upon your time. And so really your assignment is to read the introduction. Like, now that for those of you, I said, sit down, read Revelation from start to finish. Now it's not as onerous. But what I want you to do is read Revelation 1 first, and then Revelation 2 through 3 to pay attention to the structure of the letter. Look for patterns in the language, symbols, numbers, and I want you to compare specifically the letters to each other. What are similarities? What are differences? And, you know, 7 letters to 7 churches, and this repeated phrase, "I know your works." Okay, and that's for next week. So thank you. I realized tonight was a kind of a heavy, well, it's all going to be heavy, let's be honest. But what I'm hoping that this discussion about the different numbers themselves is to understand them symbolically, and to be able to and like, whether it's the symbols or the numbers, is to try and not make, you know, direct correlations, but rather let them evoke, you know, try and let them evoke what they're intended to be evocative, and to know that the symbols themselves have multiple overlaid meanings on top of each other.
So John,
Yes.
so John of Patmos wrote all of it.
Yes.
What would he have just written all of those letters within a short time period, or like how long was he exiled there?
Well, the thing is, the 7 letters to 7 churches aren't like the letters of Paul, that these are not separate pieces of correspondence. They are actually intended. It was intended that all of the early Christians would have been like that were in sort of John, well, for lack of a better term, John's distribution area would have heard this. And so, I mean, we'll get into this a little bit more next week, but these aren't individual letters, but rather effectively open letters to everybody.
I see. Okay.
That would be the best way to put it. So
Yeah.
this isn't kind of, this is for this church, this is for this church, you know, like, this is for everybody to hear. But there is some interesting bits about geography that I hope to pull up some maps next week if I can do it to show you.
Okay.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Thank
But
you.
anyway, like the other thing is, for those of you who missed last week, we specifically refer to the writer of Revelation as John of Patmos, not who is not the same as the author of the Gospel of John, is not the same as the disciple, the John the disciple, or anything like that. But we do know that the person self-identifies as John, and do know that the name John is the most common name in the world.
Yeah.
Now, granted, most people who bear the name John, it sounds like Muhammad, because
Or Nels or Hans.
yep, all and Jean is here, but like the name Muhammad is phonetically has the same root as the origins of the name John. So it is the most common name in the world, or at least certainly in the West, and in the in the Middle East, and other places, variations on it. So to say that it was this specific individual is like, there's a reason why we use the term John Smith as a generic name. So, or John Doe for that matter. So, so just do keep that in mind. But specifically, when we're talking about John, we're talking John of Patmos, because that much we know. There's a guy by the name of John on Patmos who claims as the author of this particular work, and in its entirety.
So if he was Greek, how would you say his name?
Greek would have been probably Johannes, I think, is how they would have, Johann, I think is like, my Greek, I'm better at Hebrew than I am at Greek. But if you pick up, thinking, I'm just checking to see if I've got my Greek New Testament here. But it's Yod. It kind of sounds a bit like Jan or Johann. Or Johann, like the name, like in Hebrew, it's Johanna.
So would he have been influenced? How would he have learned about?
Yeah, the other
Jesus?
John.
Like, did he get it through like Paul, when Paul did his journeys that way, or?
Well, like considering that he would have been a good 50 years after Paul, he's definitely there's definitely some influence of Paul present, and certainly in the letters that he wrote, he was operating in the same circles that specifically around Ephesus, because when we look at the different churches, Paul worked out of Ephesus, and so there's definitely some crossover with Paul.
So he could have been a descendant of somebody that Paul taught.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that makes sense too, because that's what elders do, right? They pass on the knowledge.
Yeah. And yet the knowledge is being passed on in this case to someone who's very highly educated. And is also quite artistic too.
Mm-hmm.
So which is really fun.
Yeah.
So all right. So with that, everyone, I think that is it for tonight. And so we do the 7 letters to the 7 churches next week.
Okay.
All right.
John.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
So I'm just gonna stop the share and gotta close a few windows here and end the meeting. So thanks a lot, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.